Before Rambo became one of cinema's most enduring symbols of raw survival and unstoppable will, he was almost something else entirely. The film that introduced him to the world nearly destroyed itself before it ever reached an audience. First Blood, released in 1982, stands today as a landmark of American action cinema, but the version audiences know and celebrate was built not on confidence or careful planning. It was shaped by panic, compromise, last-minute decisions, and a series of near disasters that could have buried the project completely. What nearly killed this movie is precisely what gave it life. And the story of how it came together is stranger and more fascinating than almost anything that appears on screen. The most fundamental secret about First Blood is that its hero was never supposed to walk away. David Morrell's original novel, which inspired the film, had no interest in leaving Rambo alive. In the source material, the character dies at the end, killed by Colonel Troutman, the very man who trained and shaped him into the weapon he became. It was a deliberate, devastating conclusion that treated the entire story as a tragedy with no survivors and no redemption. The film was initially scripted to follow the same path, with Stallone's character meeting an identical fate. When test audiences saw this version, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Viewers had spent the entire film growing attached to Rambo despite everything he did. They had felt his pain, understood his isolation, and invested in his survival. Watching him fall at the end felt unbearable in a way that the novel's ending never did on the page. Producers panicked, and the decision was made to let Rambo live. That single choice, made out of fear rather than vision, transformed a standalone tragedy into the foundation of a franchise. Without it, there would be no sequels, no cultural phenomenon, and no Rambo as the world came to know him. What makes this even more remarkable is that Sylvester Stallone himself nearly abandoned the project before any of this became an issue. Early versions of the script presented Rambo as a figure closer to a monster than a man. He was violent, unsympathetic, and constructed in ways that made him nearly impossible to root for. When Stallone read the material, he recognized immediately that audiences would despise rather than understand this character. The tension between his creative instincts and what the script demanded nearly ended his involvement entirely. Stallone pushed hard for changes that would humanize Rambo from the ground up. He wanted the violence to feel defensive rather than predatory. He wanted silence instead of aggression, visible trauma instead of empty rage. The production resisted at first, but Stallone held firm and made clear he was prepared to walk away if the changes weren't made. His persistence forced a creative reckoning that fundamentally reshaped the character. The Rambo who appears on screen carries genuine psychological weight rather than hollow brutality, and that transformation happened because one actor refused to accept less. Even after Stallone's intervention, early cuts of the film leaned heavily into darkness without relief. Test audiences who screened these versions didn't simply prefer something lighter. They felt actively battered by what they were watching and disconnected from a story that offered nothing to hold on to emotionally. The feedback was clear enough that producers took it seriously and began reworking specific moments throughout the edit. Scenes were trimmed, pacing was adjusted, and emotional beats were restructured to create breathing room between moments of intensity. The goal was never to remove the film's edge, but to make it bearable enough that audiences could stay engaged rather than shutting down. This process of using viewer rejection as a creative tool produced something the original version never attempted. The final cut managed to balance brutality with empathy in ways that required audiences to feel something beyond discomfort. That tonal tightrope only exists because early viewers refused to accept anything less, and the filmmakers were willing to listen. Something that gets lost in discussions of First Blood is how completely the filmmakers misjudged what audiences would take from the character. Rambo was never designed to be a hero. The original creative intention positioned him as a cautionary figure, a man destroyed by war and abandoned by the country he served, whose every act of violence underscored tragedy rather than triumph. The character existed to provoke discomfort and force viewers to confront what American society had done to its veterans. Audiences interpreted him in exactly the opposite way. They saw resilience where the filmmakers intended damage. They saw strength where the story was trying to show brokenness. Rambo's survival skills and determination read as heroic regardless of the framing around them. This gap between authorial intention and audience reception became impossible to ignore and ultimately defined the character's entire legacy. Later films abandoned the original tragic framework entirely and leaned into the heroic image viewers had decided on. The Rambo of First Blood remains distinct from everything that followed, a figure designed to haunt rather than inspire, even as the culture refused to see him that way. The source material contained a moral complexity that the film largely left behind. David Morrell's novel devoted as much attention to Sheriff Teasle as it did to Rambo, treating the two men as parallel figures on a collision course rather than hero and villain. Teasle received chapters exploring his background, his insecurities, and the war trauma he carried from his own past. Neither character was purely sympathetic or purely condemned. The book asked readers to hold genuine understanding for both men simultaneously. The film stripped most of this balance away. Teasle became an obstacle rather than a parallel figure. His motivations reduced to stubbornness and wounded pride, while Rambo's inner world expanded to fill the narrative entirely. Audiences never learned what battles Teasle carried or why he responded the way he did. This simplification sharpened the story considerably, but flattened its moral architecture. A nuanced conflict between two damaged men became something closer to a traditional showdown, and the film has been debated in simpler terms ever since. The town of Hope, which functions almost as a character in itself throughout the film, never actually existed as a single place. The fictional setting feels architecturally coherent, geographically consistent, and oppressively real in every scene, but filmmakers constructed it from multiple separate locations scattered across British Columbia. Editors and cinematographers worked meticulously to maintain the illusion of one unified, suffocating small town, choosing camera angles specifically to hide inconsistencies, and matching set dressing across locations filmed miles apart. The goal was to make Hope feel claustrophobic and inescapable, a place that trapped Rambo both physically and psychologically. Every frame reinforced the sense that this hostile environment was complete and real. The seamless construction of a fictional geography from scattered real locations demonstrates how precisely production approached its world building, because audiences needed to believe Hope was real for the story's tension to function at all. The British Columbia wilderness that made the film's visual identity was simultaneously one of the production's greatest assets and most punishing adversaries. The terrain was genuinely unforgiving, the weather completely unpredictable, and the physical demands placed on cast and crew exceeded anything a studio environment could replicate. Cast members faced real physical danger navigating steep hillsides, dense undergrowth, and unstable footing during every outdoor sequence. Crew members hauling equipment through dense forests endured daily conditions that tested their endurance in ways no shooting schedule could fully account for. Rain arrived without warning. Temperatures dropped suddenly, and natural light disappeared faster than schedules allowed. This constant battle against nature enhanced the film's authenticity in ways controlled environments never could have delivered. The exhaustion visible on screen wasn't entirely performance. The desperation carried through those chase sequences had genuine physical strain behind it, and the wilderness became an unintentional collaborator that delivered a rawness studios rarely capture. The cliff jump sequence, one of the film's most memorable moments, nearly ended production entirely before it could be completed. Stallone performed significant portions of the stunt himself, and during filming the landing went badly wrong. The impact caused real injuries, including cracked ribs that left the actor in genuine pain for weeks afterward. Production faced an immediate crisis with a leading man who was hurt, schedules already stretched, and a budget that couldn't survive a prolonged shutdown. The decision was made to continue filming despite Stallone's condition. Scenes were adjusted to accommodate limited mobility, and pain management became part of the daily production routine. The show pressed forward because stopping wasn't financially viable. The effects of those injuries are visible throughout the film if you know where to look. Certain movements appear restricted, and the physical strain reads as more than performance. Real pain leaked into the work and created an authenticity that scripted suffering rarely achieves. The helicopter pursuit sequence stands apart from typical action choreography in ways audiences instinctively recognize, even if they can't articulate why. The filming conditions were genuinely dangerous for everyone involved. Unpredictable wind patterns, limited maneuvering space, and the proximity of actors to rotating blades created an atmosphere of controlled chaos throughout filming. Pilots pushed boundaries to capture shots that felt dynamic and threatening, while cast and crew on the ground operated with full awareness that mistakes could prove catastrophic. This authentic danger translates directly to the screen. The urgency in Rambo's movements, the instability of the camera, and the rawness of the sequence all stem from real conditions that no amount of movie magic could replicate. The scene works precisely because the fear captured in it was never manufactured. Rambo's improvised traps in the forest, which demonstrated Special Forces training and resourcefulness, were considerably more extreme in earlier script versions. Original sequences featured traps designed to cause maximum damage in ways that would push the film into far more graphic territory. Producers scaled these back for practical and creative reasons as production progressed. Filming genuinely dangerous contraptions safely presented obvious challenges, but more importantly, creative discussions revealed that excessive violence would undermine the character's relatability entirely. If Rambo's traps felt gleefully brutal rather than defensively calculated, audiences might lose sympathy for him at exactly the moment the film needed them most. Restraint became a storytelling tool rather than simple censorship. The final trap sequences balance effectiveness with proportion in ways that actually strengthen the narrative, presenting a man capable of far worse who consistently chooses responses that match the threat. That limitation improved the film because it forced more thoughtful creative choices throughout. One of Stallone's most significant contributions to the film was systematic and largely invisible. The original screenplay gave Rambo far more dialogue, allowing the character to explain himself, verbalize his trauma, and engage in conversations that spelled out his psychological state for audiences who might otherwise miss it. Stallone recognized that this approach fundamentally undermined the character's power. A man broken by war and discarded by the society he served wouldn't narrate his suffering. He would internalize it until he simply couldn't anymore. Stallone removed dialogue throughout production and replaced words with silence, physicality, and expression. Scenes that once featured explanations became moments of pure reaction. Every cut line forced audiences to read the character actively rather than simply receiving information about him. This commitment to minimalism distinguished Rambo from nearly every action hero of the era and remains bold decades later. The famous breakdown scene near the film's conclusion lands with devastating impact, precisely because it shatters a silence that has been carefully maintained throughout everything that preceded it. Brian Dennehy approached Sheriff Teasle not as a villain performing villainy, but as a lawman doing his job against what he genuinely perceived as a dangerous threat. In his interpretation, Teasle was enforcing order against a drifter who refused basic compliance. Dennehy didn't play the character as someone who knew he was wrong. He played a man completely convinced of his own righteousness. This conviction reads on screen as arrogance and cruelty to audiences who have already sided with Rambo, but Dennehy's internal logic remained consistent throughout production. The disconnect between his approach and audience perception creates an interesting tension in the finished film. Teasle's absolute certainty in his own justification makes him more unsettling than a self-aware villain would ever be. The collision between two men who both genuinely believe they are the protagonists gives the conflict a moral weight that pure good versus evil storytelling can never manufacture. Early versions of the film contained significantly sharper political commentary about how America had treated its Vietnam veterans. Dialogue directly addressed institutional failures, and certain scenes functioned as explicit criticism of government neglect rather than allowing those themes to emerge through character and story. Test screenings and studio feedback prompted considerable softening during post-production. Explicit statements became implications, and direct accusations transformed into subtext. Producers worried that heavy-handed messaging would alienate audiences who arrived expecting action rather than social commentary. The restraint forced by commercial concerns accidentally made the film's critique more durable and effective than its earlier versions attempted. By embedding politics beneath character and emotion rather than announcing them through speeches, the movie reaches viewers who might resist explicit messaging. The critique lands through Rambo's suffering rather than through statements about policy failures. Jerry Goldsmith's score accomplished something that the raw footage alone could not achieve. Early edits of the film felt emotionally flat, despite the intensity of individual sequences. The violence registered, but the tragedy underneath remained stubbornly inaccessible. When Goldsmith's music entered the picture, the entire emotional landscape shifted. Audiences suddenly understood they were watching a story about pain rather than simply survival. Goldsmith composed themes that emphasized melancholy and loss rather than action and triumph, telling viewers how to feel about Rambo before the character ever spoke a word. Moments that played as merely intense, without score, became genuinely heartbreaking with it. The transformation was so complete that the film became inseparable from its music. Few films demonstrate as clearly how a composer can fundamentally redefine a movie's meaning through sound, revealing what the story was actually about rather than simply accompanying what was already visible. Production filmed both possible endings to the story within a single shooting day, capturing Rambo's death in one version and his survival in another, because nobody involved could predict with confidence which conclusion would work until audiences actually experienced both. The death ending honored the source material and completed the tragedy on its own terms. The survival ending offered something like hope and, not coincidentally, franchise potential. When test audiences overwhelmingly rejected the death version, the decision became clear that alternate endings still exist, representing the darker and more uncompromising version of the story that nearly reached screens. The film audiences embraced was quite literally a last-minute choice, and everything that followed from it, the sequels, the cultural mythology, the icon, emerged from a decision made under commercial pressure with no guarantee it was right. The cultural transformation that Rambo underwent after First Blood represents one of cinema's strangest and most thoroughly documented inversions. The original film presented a man damaged beyond repair by war and abandonment, whose violence was meant to disturb rather than inspire. The story functioned as criticism of what American society had created and then discarded. Decades of sequels and cultural adoption flipped this meaning entirely. Rambo became a symbol of American military strength. Politicians invoked his name when discussing intervention and toughness. The character designed to question war became a mascot for it. This reversal says more about audiences than about the film itself. People found in Rambo what they wanted to find, regardless of what the filmmakers put on screen. The lonely, traumatized figure resonated far less than the survivor who fought back against impossible odds, and the message that emerged from cultural absorption bore almost no resemblance to the original intention. First Blood succeeded not because of careful planning or confident execution, but because of constant adaptation to failure. Every iconic element emerged from compromise, fear, or accident. The ending that launched a franchise was a panicked last-minute change. The silence that defined the character came from deleted lines. The emotional resonance arrived through a composer's interpretation of footage that wasn't working. The authenticity came from genuine physical suffering and genuinely dangerous conditions. A cleaner, more confident production might have produced a more forgettable film. Instead, the struggle produced something raw and imperfect in ways that polished action cinema rarely achieves. The secrets behind First Blood aren't embarrassments to be hidden. They're the actual architecture of a classic, built from everything that almost went wrong.